The Northern Pacific Railroad stands as one of America's great engineering achievements, connecting the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean across nearly 2,000 miles of diverse terrain. Chartered in 1864 and completed in 1883, this transcontinental railroad transformed the Pacific Northwest from remote wilderness into a thriving economic region for over a century until its 1970 merger. The Northern Pacific served as a vital artery for commerce, settlement, and growth, linking Lake Superior to Puget Sound and opening new opportunities across Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington. Origins and Charter, 1864 to 1870. The story of the Northern Pacific Railroad begins during a pivotal moment in American history. On July 2, 1864, President Abraham Lincoln signed the congressional charter that would authorize the construction of a Northern Transcontinental Railroad. This charter represented an ambitious vision to create a rail connection spanning from the Great Lakes region all the way to the Pacific Northwest, opening vast territories to commerce and settlement. The original plan called for the railroad to stretch from Lake Superior to Puget Sound, traversing what was then largely unexplored territory. Congress sweetened the deal with generous land grants, offering the railroad company alternating sections of public land along the proposed route. For every mile of track laid, the company would receive thousands of acres, which they could sell to finance construction. This land grant system had been used successfully with other railroads and represented the federal government's commitment to expanding the nation's transportation infrastructure. However, the reality of building such an ambitious project proved far more difficult than anyone anticipated. The initial years following the charter saw little actual progress. The company struggled to secure adequate financing, and the ongoing events of the 1860s diverted attention and resources elsewhere. Investors were hesitant to commit large sums to what seemed like an incredibly risky venture across thousands of miles of undeveloped land. The breakthrough came in 1869 when Cooke, one of America's most prominent financiers, agreed to become the Northern Pacific's primary banker. Cooke had made his reputation financing government bonds and was known for his innovative marketing techniques. He brought not only capital but also credibility to the project, helping to attract additional investors through aggressive promotion campaigns. With Cooke's involvement, the dream of a Northern Transcontinental Railroad finally seemed achievable. Construction begins 1870 to 1873 with financing secured. Construction finally commenced in earnest in 1870. Groundbreaking ceremonies marked the official start of work at both ends of the proposed route. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. Engineers faced the challenge of laying track across diverse and often hostile terrain, from the forests of Minnesota to the prairies of Dakota Territory, through the Rocky Mountains, and finally over the Cascade Range to reach the Pacific. The labor force that built the Northern Pacific was diverse and faced difficult conditions. Workers endured extreme temperatures, from brutal prairie winters to scorching summer heat. They dealt with insects, limited supplies, and the constant physical demands of railroad construction. Crews had to grade roadbeds, blast through rock formations, construct bridges over rivers and ravines, and lay thousands of miles of track, all with the technology available in the early 1870s. As construction pushed westward, tensions arose over land and resources. The railroad's route crossed territories that indigenous peoples had inhabited for generations. Different groups had varying relationships with the land the railroad sought to traverse, and the presence of construction crews and the permanent infrastructure they created led to conflicts. These tensions reflected the broader changes occurring across the American West during this period as traditional ways of life encountered rapid industrial expansion. Despite the challenges, progress continued for several years. Then disaster struck. The Panic of 1873, a severe financial crisis, swept through the American economy. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and the financial markets seized up. Cooke's banking empire was among the casualties, declaring bankruptcy in September 1873. Without their primary financier, the Northern Pacific couldn't pay its workers or suppliers. Construction ground to a halt, with only about 500 miles of track completed, leaving the transcontinental dream unfulfilled and the company in ruins. Reorganization and completion, 1875 to 1883. The Northern Pacific spent the next 2 years in financial reorganization. In 1875, Frederick Billings, a Vermont lawyer and businessman, took control of the company and began the slow process of rebuilding. Billings brought stability and practical management to the troubled railroad. Under his leadership, construction resumed, though at a more cautious pace than before. The late 1870s saw steady but unspectacular progress. The company focused on consolidating what had been built and extending the line incrementally. Then, in 1881, a new figure entered the picture. Henry Villard, a German-born journalist turned financier. Villard had made a fortune in railroad investments and saw opportunity in the Northern Pacific. Through a series of bold financial moves, he gained control of the company and brought fresh capital to the project. Villard accelerated construction dramatically. Multiple crews worked simultaneously along different sections of the route, racing to complete the transcontinental connection. The work became increasingly difficult as the railroad approached the Rocky Mountains and then the Cascades. Engineers devised creative solutions to navigate mountain passes, including temporary switchbacks that would later be replaced with tunnels. The terrain in Montana and Idaho tested the limits of contemporary engineering capabilities. The climactic moment came on September 8, 1883, at Gold Creek, Montana. Dignitaries, workers, and spectators gathered for the last spike ceremony. Marking the completion of the Northern Pacific's transcontinental line, former President Ulysses Grant drove the final spike, completing a railroad that stretched nearly 2,000 miles from Lake Superior to Puget Sound. After 19 years of planning, financing, construction, bankruptcy, and reorganization, the Northern Transcontinental Railroad was finally complete. Geographic route and engineering feats, the completed Northern Pacific Railroad represented a triumph of engineering across some of North America's most challenging landscapes. The eastern terminus sat at Duluth, Minnesota, on the shores of Lake Superior. From there, the line stretched westward through the forests and lakes of Minnesota, entering the vast prairies of Dakota Territory. The terrain gradually rose as the railroad approached the Rocky Mountains, requiring careful grading to maintain manageable grades for steam locomotives. Montana presented particular challenges with its mountain ranges and river crossings. The railroad had to navigate through passes and construct substantial bridges over the Missouri, Yellowstone, and other major rivers. Each bridge represented a significant engineering project, requiring careful foundation work and sturdy construction to handle the weight of locomotives and freight cars while withstanding seasonal flooding and ice. Idaho's Panhandle brought the railroad through heavily forested mountains before entering Washington Territory. Here, engineers faced perhaps their greatest challenge, crossing the Cascade Range to reach Puget Sound. The solution involved the Stampede Pass Tunnel, a major engineering undertaking that would take years to complete. Initially, the railroad used temporary switchbacks to cross the mountains, a slow and operationally difficult solution that required trains to zigzag back and forth up the mountainside. The western terminus at Tacoma, Washington, gave the Northern Pacific access to deep-water ports on Puget Sound. This location proved strategically valuable for trade with Asia and Alaska, though it would later become a point of contention with Seattle, which also sought to become a major railroad terminus. Throughout the route, engineers had to account for extreme weather conditions. Winter snowfall in the mountains could block tracks for extended periods. The company established snow sheds in the most vulnerable areas and maintained crews ready to clear drifts. In the Dakotas and Montana, prairie winters brought blizzards and extreme cold that could freeze equipment and make operations treacherous. Summer brought different challenges, including prairie fires and extreme heat that could warp rails. The railroad's maintenance requirements were constant and substantial. Economic impact and development. The completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad fundamentally transformed the economic geography of the northern United States. Regions that had been remote and difficult to access suddenly became connected to national and international markets. This connectivity sparked rapid development across multiple industries and attracted waves of new residents seeking opportunity. Agriculture flourished along the railroad's route. The fertile prairies of the Dakotas and Montana proved ideal for wheat cultivation. Farmers could now ship their harvests to distant markets efficiently and economically. The Northern Pacific actively promoted settlement, selling land from its federal land grants and advertising the region's agricultural potential in the eastern United States and Europe. Towns sprang up at regular intervals along the line, many initially as simple railroad stops that gradually developed into agricultural service centers. The timber industry experienced explosive growth, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. The vast forests of Washington, Idaho, and Montana contained enormous stands of valuable lumber. Before the railroad, harvesting this timber for distant markets was impractical. The Northern Pacific changed everything, allowing lumber companies to ship their products to rapidly growing cities across the country. Sawmill towns emerged along the route, and forestry became a cornerstone of the regional economy. Mining operations also benefited tremendously from railroad access. Montana's rich mineral deposits, including copper, silver, and gold, could now be extracted and shipped economically. The Butte Mining District became one of the world's major copper producers, with the Northern Pacific hauling ore and supplies. Similar developments occurred at mining sites throughout the railroad's territory. The railroad didn't just connect existing communities, it created new ones. Many towns owed their existence entirely to the Northern Pacific's route decisions. The company laid out town sites, sold lots, and sometimes built initial facilities to encourage settlement. Some communities thrived and grew into substantial cities, while others remained small service centers. A few eventually became ghost towns when circumstances changed, but the overall pattern was one of sustained growth and development. Immigration increased dramatically as the Northern Pacific promoted settlement. The company distributed promotional materials in multiple languages, touting the opportunities available along its route. European immigrants, particularly Scandinavians and Germans, arrived in large numbers, bringing farming expertise suited to the northern climate. This population influx created markets for goods and services, further stimulating economic development. Operations and expansion, 1883 to 1920, with the main line complete. The Northern Pacific entered a period of operational refinement and expansion. The railroad developed an extensive network of branch lines reaching into productive agricultural and timber regions away from the main route. These branches collected freight for transfer to the main line and distributed goods to smaller communities, creating a comprehensive transportation network. The company established connections with other railroad systems, allowing for efficient through traffic. Passengers and freight could move seamlessly between the Northern Pacific and connecting line, expanding the market reach for shippers and creating more travel options for passengers. These connections made the railroad more valuable and competitive. Passenger service became an important part of operations. The Northern Pacific operated regular trains carrying travelers across its system. Luxurious sleeping cars and dining cars made long-distance travel more comfortable. The company promoted tourism, particularly access to Yellowstone National Park, which became a major attraction. Special tourist trains brought visitors from the east to experience the wonders of the west. Freight remained the economic backbone of the railroad. Long trains carried wheat, lumber, minerals, and manufactured goods across the system. Eastbound trains typically hauled raw materials and agricultural products to processing centers and markets. Westbound trains brought manufactured goods, machinery, and supplies to developing communities. This two-way traffic provided balanced operations and steady revenue. Competition with other transcontinental railroads intensified during this period. The Great Northern Railway, built by James J. Hill, followed a more northern route and became a fierce competitor. The Union Pacific and other railroads offered alternative routes across the continent. This competition drove improvements in service, efficiency, and rates, benefiting shippers and travelers while pressuring railroad management to operate effectively. Technological improvements continued throughout this era. Locomotives became larger and more powerful, capable of hauling heavier trains. Steel rails replaced iron on heavily trafficked sections, lasting longer and supporting greater weights. Automatic couplers and air brakes improved safety and operational efficiency. Telegraph lines along the route enabled better coordination and scheduling. These incremental improvements, accumulating over decades, transformed railroad operations. The railroad's role in regional growth, the Northern Pacific's influence extended far beyond simply providing transportation. The railroad fundamentally shaped the development trajectory of the entire northern tier of the United States, affecting everything from agriculture to urban planning. Wheat farming became the dominant agricultural activity across the Dakotas and Montana. The railroad not only transported the grain, but also influenced farming practices through its land, sales, and promotional activities. The company encouraged settlers to try dryland farming techniques suitable for the semi-arid climate. Massive wheat harvests moved eastward on Northern Pacific trains each fall, bound for mills and export terminals. This grain trade became so important that fluctuations in wheat prices directly affected the railroad's financial performance. The lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest developed in close partnership with the railroad. Logging operations located near the tracks for easy shipping access, the Northern Pacific hauled millions of board feet of lumber annually to markets throughout the country. This symbiotic relationship meant that the railroad's prosperity was tied to the timber industry's health and vice versa. As forests near the line were harvested, logging operations moved to new areas, sometimes requiring new branch lines. Port development at Tacoma and other Puget Sound locations accelerated with railroad access. The Northern Pacific's terminus gave these ports a crucial connection to the interior, allowing them to compete for Asian trade and Alaska commerce. Ships arriving from across the Pacific could unload cargo for rail transport inland, while exports from the interior could be loaded for overseas shipment. This gateway function made the Puget Sound ports economically vital. Mail and communication services rode the rails. Before widespread telephone service and highways, the railroad carried mail, newspapers, and telegrams across its system. This communication link kept remote communities connected to the wider world. Railway post office cars sorted mail en route, speeding delivery. For many communities, the daily train represented their primary connection to distant places and events. The railroad's impact on indigenous communities was profound and complex. As the Northern Pacific expanded its operations, traditional land use patterns changed. The railroad brought permanent settlement to areas that had been used differently for generations. Some indigenous people found employment with the railroad, while others faced displacement as development accelerated. The railroad served as a conduit for change, facilitating the transformation of the region's demographic and economic landscape. The Northern Pacific actively promoted immigration and land sales through extensive marketing campaigns. Company agents distributed promotional literature describing opportunities along the route. Special immigrant trains brought new arrivals directly to settlement areas. The railroad offered reduced fares for land seekers and sometimes provided temporary housing. This aggressive promotion successfully attracted thousands of settlers. Though the marketing materials sometimes overstated the ease of frontier life, challenges and setbacks despite its transformative impact, the Northern Pacific faced recurring challenges throughout its history. Financial stability proved elusive, with the company entering receivership multiple times. The financial panic of 1893 triggered another collapse, and the railroad went into receivership again in 1896. These financial troubles reflected both broader economic conditions and issues specific to railroad operations and management. Labor relations presented ongoing difficulties. Railroad work was demanding and sometimes dangerous. Workers sought better wages, hours, and conditions, leading to periodic disputes and strikes. These labor actions could disrupt operations and strain finances. Management sought to balance worker concerns with financial pressures from investors and creditors, not always successfully. Competition from other transportation methods gradually eroded the railroad's market position. River transport competed for some freight traffic. As highways improved and motor vehicles became common, trucks began carrying freight that once moved exclusively by rail. Passenger automobiles and buses offered flexibility that trains couldn't match. The Northern Pacific had to adapt its strategy as the transportation landscape evolved. Natural disasters periodically disrupted operations. Floods washed out bridges and tracks, requiring expensive repairs and rerouting of traffic. Forest fires threatened trestles and other wooden structures. Rock slides in mountain areas could block tracks for extended periods. Winter storms remained a constant challenge despite decades of experience managing snow. Each disaster required emergency response and financial resources to restore service. Economic depressions reduced traffic and revenue. When agricultural prices fell, farmers shipped less grain and had less money for purchases, reducing both eastbound and westbound traffic. Mining slumps similarly affected freight volumes. During economic downturns, passenger traffic declined as people traveled less. The railroad's fixed costs remained high even when revenue fell, creating financial pressure. Maintenance and upgrade costs never ceased. Rails wore out and required replacement. Bridges needed periodic rebuilding. Locomotives and cars had limited lifespans. Stations and facilities required upkeep. As equipment grew larger and heavier, infrastructure needed strengthening. These capital requirements consumed profits and sometimes required borrowing, adding to financial pressure. The modern era, 1920 to 1970, The decades following World War I brought profound changes to American railroading, and the Northern Pacific evolved, along with the industry. The transition from steam to diesel locomotives represented perhaps the most visible transformation. Diesel-electric locomotives proved more efficient, required less maintenance, and eliminated the need for water towers and coal handling facilities. The Northern Pacific began desulization in the 1940s, gradually retiring its steam fleet over the following decades. Streamliner passenger trains brought modern style and improved service to long-distance rail travel. The Northern Pacific introduced its flagship North Coast Limited as a streamlined train, featuring sleek locomotives, modern cars, and enhanced amenities. These trains represented the railroad attempt to compete with airline and automobile travel through superior service and comfort. For a time, streamliners successfully attracted passengers who appreciated the convenience and experience of rail travel. World War II dramatically increased railroad traffic as the nation mobilized for war. Troop trains, munitions, military equipment, and strategic materials moved in unprecedented volumes. The Northern Pacific operated at capacity with every available locomotive and car pressed into service. This intensive use generated substantial revenue but also deferred maintenance and wore out equipment that couldn't be replaced during wartime industrial priorities. The post-war period initially seemed promising, with continued strong freight traffic. However, passenger service began a long decline that would prove irreversible. Automobiles became more affordable and highways improved, giving travelers flexibility that trains couldn't offer. Airlines captured long-distance travelers seeking speed. Despite the streamliner's appeal, passenger trains became increasingly unprofitable. The Northern Pacific, like other railroads, found itself operating passenger service more from obligation than economic logic. Highway competition affected freight traffic as well. Trucks proved superior for short-haul and time-sensitive shipments, gradually claiming market share that had once belonged exclusively to railroads. The Northern Pacific adapted by focusing on commodities best suited to rail transport: bulk materials, long-distance shipments, and heavy freight. The railroad also improved its intermodal capabilities, carrying truck trailers on flat cars to combine rail efficiency with trucking flexibility. Freight patterns shifted over these decades. Traditional agricultural and lumber traffic remained important, but manufactured goods and containers became increasingly significant. The railroad modernized its freight car fleet with specialized equipment for different commodities. Operations became more sophisticated, using new communication technologies and management techniques to improve efficiency and customer service. Merger and legacy in 1970. By the late 1960s, railroad industry economics pointed toward consolidation. The Northern Pacific, Great Northern Railway, Chicago, Burlington and Quincy Railroad, and Spokane, Portland and Seattle Railway had long cooperated and shared some facilities. In 1970, these railroads formally merged to create the Burlington Northern Railroad, one of the nation's largest rail systems. The merger reflected economic reality. Individual railroads struggled with declining passenger revenue, infrastructure costs, and intense competition. Combining operations promised efficiencies through eliminated duplicate facilities, consolidated management, and optimized routing. The merged company could negotiate more effectively with customers and allocate capital more efficiently. For the Northern Pacific, the merger meant the end of independent operations after 106 years. The distinctive Northern Pacific Monad logo disappeared from locomotives and cars, replaced by Burlington Northern's green and white scheme. Operating practices unified across the merged system. The Northern Pacific, as a separate corporate entity, ceased to exist, though its roots and infrastructure remained vital parts of the combined network. Historical preservation efforts ensured that the Northern Pacific's legacy wouldn't be forgotten. Museums acquired locomotives, passenger cars, and artifacts. Historical societies collected documents, photographs, and employee records. Railroad enthusiasts documented the system's history through research and publication. Some preserved equipment operates on heritage railroads, allowing new generations to experience historic trains. The Northern Pacific's infrastructure continues serving commerce today. Many routes remain active as part of what is now BNSF Railway following subsequent mergers. Trains still traverse the same mountain passes and river crossings that challenged 19th-century engineers. The transportation corridor the Northern Pacific pioneered remains economically vital, carrying freight that sustains regional and national commerce. Cultural and historical significance beyond its economic impact, The Northern Pacific holds significant cultural and historical importance. The railroad played a central role in the expansion narrative, opening territories to settlement and development. This story has been told and retold in countless ways, shaping how people understand American growth and transformation. The architectural legacy remains visible in surviving stations and structures. Some Northern Pacific depots still stand, repurposed for new uses while retaining their historic character. These buildings represent a distinctive architectural style and serve as tangible connections to the railroad era. Preservation efforts have saved some of the most significant structures from demolition. The railroad influenced American literature and art. Writers incorporated railroad themes into their work, and artists captured trains in paintings and photographs. The Northern Pacific itself commissioned artwork promoting its routes and services. This artistic output documented contemporary views of railroading, while creating lasting cultural artifacts. Railroad museums throughout the Northern Pacific's territory preserve and interpret this history. Collections include everything from massive locomotives to small artifacts of daily railroad life. Interactive exhibits help visitors understand how railroads operated and affected communities. These institutions serve vital educational and preservation functions, ensuring future generations can learn about this important chapter of American history. Reserved locomotives and rolling stock provide tangible connections to the past. Enthusiasts have rescued and restored Northern Pacific equipment, some of which operates on heritage railroads. Seeing, hearing, and sometimes riding behind historic locomotives creates understanding that no book or documentary can fully convey. These preservation efforts require dedication and resources, but maintain important links to history. The Northern Pacific's impact on regional identity, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, remains significant. The railroad helped define these areas, attracting settlers, building communities, and establishing economic patterns. Towns celebrate their railroad heritage through festivals and historic markers. The Northern Pacific remains part of local identity and pride. The Northern Pacific Railroad story encompasses triumph and failure, vision and pragmatism, ambition and limitation. From its 1864 charter through its 1970 merger, the railroad transformed the northern United States. It connected isolated regions to national markets, enabled new industries, built communities, and created opportunities for millions of people. Much of the infrastructure the Northern Pacific built remains in use today, testament to the quality of its engineering and the enduring value of its route. Modern freight trains follow alignments surveyed over a century ago, crossing bridges and traversing mountain passes that challenge the railroad's builders. This continuing utility demonstrates the Northern Pacific's lasting practical contribution. The railroad's history offers lessons about transportation, development, and the challenges of large-scale infrastructure projects. Building the Northern Pacific required vision, capital, engineering skill, and persistence through multiple setbacks. Its operational history shows how economic conditions, competition, and technological change affect transportation enterprises. These lessons remain relevant as contemporary society addresses its own infrastructure needs. The Northern Pacific Railroad occupies an important place in American industrial history as one of the great transcontinental railroads. While perhaps less famous than some other lines, its impact on regional development was profound. The railroad opened the Pacific Northwest, enabled agriculture across the northern plains, and provided essential transportation infrastructure for over a century. Its story is fundamentally part of the story of American growth and development, demonstrating both the possibilities and challenges of ambitious infrastructure projects that transform landscapes and economies.